Welcome to Misquoting Jesus with Bart Ehrman, the only show where a 6-time New York Times best-selling author and world-renowned Bible scholar uncovers the many fascinating, little-known facts about the New Testament, the historical Jesus, and the rise of Christianity. I'm your host, Megan Lewis. Let's begin.
Well, I'd like to welcome everyone to this special edition of the Misquoting Jesus podcast. This time, instead of being interviewed myself, I'm doing the interviewing. And this is great because I don't have to answer any hard questions. My guest today is Mark Goodacre, whom many of you will know quite well, but I will be introducing him. And we will be talking today about the Gospel of Thomas, which is, I think, without a doubt, the most important gospel not in the New Testament, at least for modern scholarship and for sort of general audience interest. So, but first, welcome, Mark. Hello. Hi.
Hi, Bart. Thank you very much. It's a very great honor to be on your podcast. Wow.
Well, okay, Mark. As listeners know, you have your own podcast as well, and is it just called the Mark Goodacre podcast?
No, it's called the NT Pod. It's just nice and short. New Testament Pod, but NT Pod. NT Pod. Very good. Yeah, makes it really easy to remember, so that if people Google stuff, they can just Google that. But yeah, you can get to it by just going Mark Goodacre podcast.
Is that just one word? NT Pod.
No, it's two words, but it's sort of it's two words.
And are there any periods in there? Is it N period? Nope, just NT.
No.
Okay.
It all started because I used to have the New Testament Gateway, and I started abbreviating that to NT Gateway and ntgateway.com. And then when I did my blog, it was NT Blog. So when I started my podcast about 10 years ago, I just thought, well, NT Pod, So that it was a family of stuff. It was a family of internet stuff.
Okay. Yeah. Well, you can trace the lineage of these things. And New Testament scholars are good at that. That's what we do. So
that's right.
Well, as you all know, if you don't know Mark, you can tell already he's a Brit. and Mark, let me just give you a brief introduction to him. Even though he is a Brit and spent most of his life in Britain, he's now the Francis Hill Fox Professor of Religious Studies at Duke University, and he now serves as the chair of the Department of Religious Studies. That is everyone who chairs a department in this climate knows that's a hugely onerous job. It's very hard to do any work when you're trying to push papers the whole time. So, Mark, thank you for taking time out here. Mark. So Mark did his education in England. In fact, he spent his entire education, I believe, at Oxford. Is that correct? Mm-hmm. Yeah, 1985 to 1994. He did both his bachelor's and his master's and his doctorate there at Oxford. And then after that, in 1995, he became a lecturer. Which is the title. The titles in England don't correspond to the titles we use here, but a lecturer in the Department of Theology and Religion at the University of Birmingham. Mark has had a long and distinguished career as a New Testament scholar and is well known both in the field among scholars, but also among layfolk, because he reaches out a lot to people who are not scholars to help communicate knowledge about the New Testament and especially about the Gospels. Mark has authored a number of books on the Gospels, starting with was this your dissertation, the Golder and the Gospels?
Yeah, it was. Yeah,
that's a reference to one of his teachers, Michael Golder. And then he has books on the synoptic problem and Q. And his most recent book is Thomas. Is this the most recent book?
Yeah.
The most recent, Thomas and the Gospels. He's working on another one now, dealing with the Gospel of John and the synoptic Gospels. We're going to be talking about the Thomas today. Is going to be the focus of our attention. We'll get to his book at one point. The conversation is not going to focus just on the book. It's going to deal broadly with really interesting issues about the Gospel of Thomas. if I had to characterize Mark's publishing career, I'd say that the thing that he's probably best known for is for a disturbing scholarly orthodoxies. The rest of us all think something, and Mark says, "Yeah, I actually know," and then he writes a book to prove it.
Yeah.
And so, for a long time, since throughout the 20th century, most scholars believed in a hypothetical source for Matthew and Luke that they call Q, and Mark has written a book arguing Q didn't exist. Scholars have argued that that Luke did not use the Gospel of Matthew, and Mark has argued that yes, he did. Scholars, when I was in graduate school, the orthodoxy was that the author of the Gospel of John did not use the Synoptic Gospels, and Mark's current project is arguing yes, he did, and there's been a long-standing debate since the discovery of the Gospel of Thomas whether it knew the Matthew, Mark, and Luke or not, and that's been a long and divisive debate, which has gone back and forth. And Mark has taken a very definitive stand on that in his most recent book. And so as I said, we'll be getting to that later. So, So Mark, thanks again for being here with us.
Well, thanks for the intro. I like the idea of me being some kind of spoil sport, and there is some truth to that. I don't know whether it says something disturbing about my psychological makeup that I just want to disagree with people. Maybe it's because I'm sort of relatively agreeable person in real life that when it gets to the scholarship, I really want to have some fun.
Well, for those of you who don't know Mark, I'll say that Mark is one of the nicest human beings on the planet. And very few people have said that about me. Yeah. So I notice these things.
I like you.
Oh, thank you. I'm glad someone did. So, but the other thing, Mark, you really are interested in who used what.
Right. Yeah.
In the ancient world, the issue of sources, which is hugely significant for understanding the New Testament and the early Christian literature. Because if one author used another writing, and that obviously affects how that author does his own thing, but also you can look at to see how he's changed it or how he's left it the same. And if these are, maybe sometimes he even incorporates ideas that aren't his own ideas, he's just gotten it from someone else. And so, but that,
you're right. Yeah. I mean, no, I do think it's important to know what people's sources are. Some people think it's just terribly old fashioned to worry about source criticism and so on. But I mean, to take the example of Luke using Matthew and so on, if I'm right, then you've already got a kind of a conversation going on inside the canon, inside the New Testament itself. You've not just got these isolated communities doing their isolated thing. You've actually got some quite interesting interactions. And I think that's historically quite exciting because it basically gives you access to how person A was influencing person B. I mean, obviously we're doing it through text A and text B, but ultimately these are human authors that are crafting their work around a particular bit of source material. So I do think it is interesting for revealing a bit more about the history. Of course, if I'm right, of course, if I'm wrong, then it could be quite distracting.
Well, it could be distracting, but it could also mean that it's just a different community. Okay, we're not going to get there because
no,
because we should do that on another podcast. Because that's one we disagree on more.
Yeah, that'd be fun.
So, but you're the expert on this, So, all right. So, we're going to talk about a gospel that's not in the New Testament today, the Gospel of Thomas, and it is, it's one of the books that people call an apocryphal gospel. Could you just kind of explain what that means to people who aren't, apocryphal?
Sure. One of the hardest things about studying books that aren't in the New Testament is what do you call them? Because, I do a course called Non-Canonical Gospels, and the Gospel of Thomas is the first one that we study in that. And some people say to me, you shouldn't call it non-canonical Gospels because you're then trying to define the thing by what it's not, i.e. not being in the canon. And there is this worry that we make canon normative and, that's the orthodoxy. So because of that, sometimes people call them apocryphal gospels on analogy with the Apocrypha of the Old Testament. And that's possibly a preferable term, especially as something like the Gospel of Thomas actually owns itself as a piece of Apocrypha, because the term Apocrypha basically means, something that's hidden. or the hidden thing that's coming out, the secret thing that's coming out. And that's exactly what Thomas basically does. It says that it's got the secret sayings of the living Jesus, and he's basically saying at the beginning, I tell you what, I'm going to tell you what they are. I'm going to tell you what Jesus said in secret to his disciples. So that's roughly what an apocryphal gospel is, and Thomas is the quintessential one.
Okay, well, thanks. It is kind of interesting because apocryphal does mean something like hidden, right? It's like,
right, exactly.
Hidden, we got it. Okay, so can you just tell us something about like how we got this thing, this Gospel of Thomas? Just give us kind of a bit. Yeah, it showed up from.
Well, the Gospel of Thomas was well known in antiquity, so people as early as the 2nd century were already referring to the Gospel of Thomas, but at some point it gets lost. And when scholars talk about things getting lost, they don't mean that someone misplaced it. They basically just mean people stopped copying it. And at some point, people just stopped copying it. And that means that it fell into oblivion. And by the medieval period, no one was reading it anymore. And for much of the 19th century, people just bemoaned the idea we would ever see it again. But then there are basically a couple of wonderfully fortuitous discoveries. The first is a couple of Oxford theologians, Grenfell and Hunt. Well, actually, I should say classicists, Grenfell and Hunt. They went digging in Oxyrhynchus in Egypt. And in 1897, a little piece of the Gospel of Thomas showed its head above the sand of where they were digging. And it's known as P. Oxy 1, Papyrus Oxyrhynchus 1. And that is the first bit of the Gospel of Thomas that anybody saw for hundreds of years.
Can I stop you on that?
Yeah, of course.
Could you tell us what people may not know what Oxyrhynchus is unless they're a papyrologist? Sure. What Oxyrhynchus? What's that?
So Oxyrhynchus basically was a big old rubbish dump in antiquity where people got a whole bunch of their documents and just tossed them. And it's like it's just for any scholar of antiquity, it's a treasure trove, because what turned up there were not just biblical manuscripts and text-like bits of the Gospel of Thomas, but dozens of letters and contracts, and you just get this fantastic slice of life from ancient Egypt. Just so valuable.
So, I mean, you can correct me on this because I'm not an expert in this, but as I understand, Grenfell and Hunt actually they wanted to find manuscripts, but they how do you go out and find a manuscript? You can't just go to Egypt with your shovel and start digging someplace. And so, but they did know that there was this city Oxyrhynchus, and they tried to find the garbage dump. Is that right? Because they're thinking, well, where else are you going to find leftover manuscripts? Right? So people throw them out. Is that? Yeah,
because I think it was their teacher Frederick Fyvie who speculated that these mounds might actually be mounds that have documentary leftovers there. So I think it was that bit of speculation which just kind of wonderfully came off. I mean, it's just, and they're still all not published, are they? I mean,
thousands of them,
tons of them.
They come out all the time. But so this is called P. Oxyrhynchus 1 because it was the first one that was discovered.
First one they published. I mean, it's not clear it's the first one that they wrote, because they just basically put it in a. Sorry, my phone's going off. Give me a sec. To remind myself how to. There we go. I apologize. Let me go back to that. So P-Oxy 1. Yes. So it wasn't necessarily the first one that they actually discovered, but it was the first one that they published. And it was a little 8-year-old child. They were using child labor there. A little 8-year-old child brought it to them, and they placed the thing in a biscuit tin. And they took all the fragments they found back to Oxford, and they wanted to publish this first just because they could see that it was unknown sayings of Jesus, so that they called it the logia of Jesus, the words of Jesus, and it caused quite a stir.
Yes. So early on in their dig, they find this thing. It's this little scrap of papyrus, and there's this saying of Jesus on it, but they don't know it's the Gospel of Thomas at this point, right? No. It's just like it's a saying of Jesus they'd never heard before.
Right. Yeah. Well, the first thing that they noticed, because the saying's got a parallel in Matthew and Luke. It's the saying, or the first one they saw, it's the saying about the log and the speck, where the guy says, don't try, taking the speck out of your brother's eye, when there's a log in your own eye. And they recognize those words. So that's paralleled in Matthew and Luke. But then they noticed straight away that there were other sayings in there that are not paralleled in any of the canonical gospels. So they knew it wasn't an extant gospel. It was some other thing, but they didn't know what it was at that point.
Okay. Yeah. So it has, yeah. Okay. Do you happen to know like one of those other sayings are so people could see, yeah, that doesn't sound like.
Yeah, good question. So what do we go on with? I think we have there as well, the extraordinary saying about the lion. Blessed is the lion who eats a man.
Yes.
Which is just unfathomably odd.
Yeah, it's the one of these sayings that I've never figured out. I've thought about that saying for 30 years. I still don't know it.
Yeah.
I mean, I have theories about it, but it's like nothing really works very well. So, okay, well, we'll get to some of the weird sayings in a little bit, I guess. So, all right, so that was the first. They find this thing, and they realize this probably comes of, and maybe they're publishing this first then because they think this will, I don't know, maybe they're thinking it'll provide funding, like people will realize. Oh, my God,
there's you can go back. There's a whole bunch of stuff from the late 1890s where this was sensational. It went on the first page of the Times of London that this new sayings of Jesus have been discovered. So sometimes we think that it's our age that comes up with the sensational discoveries, but they were there right back then. And yeah, they didn't hold back on how it. You're absolutely right, and they did get funding, of course, to go back again. And when they went back again, they found some more.
Yeah, good strategy. Yeah, well, they found thousands, as we know. So, okay, so that you said that was the first time we knew something. We didn't know it was the Gospel of Thomas, but we knew this thing was there. Then what's the second then?
So then in 1904, they published two more fragments. They didn't know that for certain they were part of the same thing that P-Oxy 1 was from, but they're P-Oxy 654 and 655. And 654 is the really interesting one because for a start, it's published on the back of a land contract, a really messy land contract. So it's not like a whole scroll or a whole codex. And it's really badly written, like it's a school exercise or something. The first three words barely even make sense, but you can just make out that it says these are the secret sayings that the living Jesus spoke to Didymus, Judas, Thomas. So then they were able to say, aha, this looks like the beginning of a gospel that we've not seen before. And so that's where you begin to think, gosh, are there fragments of this thing existing? And then 655 is similar. It's from a different bit, as it turns out, of the Gospel of Thomas, and has, again, just like 654, just like 1, some parallels with the Synoptic Gospels and some completely new sayings.
So how did they decide they all belong together and they belong to something called the Gospel of Thomas?
They actually weren't entirely certain that they were all part of the same thing because the three pieces are from different hands. One's written on a roll, one's written on a codex, and one's written on the back of a land contract. So they were able to speculate that they could be, but there's no way of proving that it's from an original piece.
So why do we know they are?
We know that it is because eventually, sadly, long after Grenfell and Hunt had left this world, we get a discovery elsewhere in Egypt, in Nag Hammadi, of this incredible tranche of 12, some people say 13, but 12 codices, ancient books, all in a pot. And in amongst those, in Codex 2 from Nag Hammadi, is the second book in that codex is a complete version of the Gospel of Thomas in Coptic, which is dead exciting.
Okay, so when you use the word codex, you're referring to what we would call a book today, where you take the pages, you write on both sides of the page, you sew them together, and that wasn't the normal way of writing a book in the ancient world. Usually they'd use rolls or scrolls, but then Christians especially started using them. So they find these codices in Nag Hammadi, and so in the second one they have this Gospel of Thomas, right? And how do we know it's complete? How do we know it's not fragmentary?
Well, I mean, I suppose in theory there could have been more that they haven't copied up. But I mean, what I mean is that it begins with the same thing that we already had from P-Oxy 1. These are the secret sayings of the living Jesus. And then when you get to the end of it, you get the colophon where it basically says the gospel according to Thomas. So it looks like the person that wrote that thought that this was a complete gospel.
Yeah. Okay. So what's in it? What's in the Gospel of Thomas?
It's basically 114 sayings of Jesus. It doesn't have any narrative, and it simply keeps going. Jesus says, Jesus says, Jesus says. And then occasionally, to break it up, you'll get Peter asks Jesus, ... and then you'll get Jesus says, Jesus says, and then Salome said, and then Jesus said. So you do get disciples and others popping up as foils, but much of the time it's simply Jesus says. And no narratives, no miracle stories, no passion narrative, no birth narrative. So definitely something very different from the Gospels that we're used to from the New Testament.
So there's no death and resurrection here. No
Right.
Okay. So Mark, what's in the Gospel of Thomas?
Well, the thing is, the Gospel of Thomas doesn't look like any of the Gospels that we are familiar with from the New Testament. So that's probably the fundamental thing. Yes, it's got loads and loads of parallels to the Gospels in the New Testament. It's got lots of parallels to Matthew, lots to Luke, lots to Mark, not much to John. But the parallels are all basically sayings of Jesus. And that's the fundamental thing about the Gospel of Thomas, is it's a book of sayings. We tend to enumerate them as 114 sayings, but they're all just Jesus says, Jesus says, Jesus says all the way through. Occasionally you'll get somebody else, like a disciple, Peter or Salome, or a group of disciples doing a little intro, asking Jesus a question. And then Jesus will respond with, well, Jesus says. So, but it's fundamentally a sayings gospel. If there's ever a sayings gospel, this is it. It's basically Jesus as a talking head.
So, okay. So there's no action. There's no, he's not doing anything.
That's, and there isn't. And that's why lots of people, when they first encounter the Gospel of Thomas, feel disappointed, because they are so, all of us, even if you have never been to church in your life, you know stuff about Christianity, like the death, resurrection, the parable of the Good Samaritan, all this kind of stuff, you know, the feeding of the 5,000. But Thomas, it just doesn't even have a single one of those miracle stories. Not a single one. There's nothing. There's no death. There's no resurrection. There's no narrative, really. Narrative fragments, but there's no stories. And that's like, it's straight away, it's quite shocking if you're familiar with the canonical Gospels.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I think most people assume that if you're going to write a gospel, you're going to deal with the most important things in Jesus' life. And if you don't have miracles and you don't have a death and resurrection, right. Do scholars think this author has like a different view of what's important about Jesus? I mean, because it's not a death and resurrection. Like, it's nice. He's got some good sayings, but so does Benjamin Franklin, who doesn't save your soul. So what? So,
and exactly. Well, to that extent, I think that it's not just that the author of this book has made a decision to do a bunch of quotations. I mean, you do get that about great figures. I've actually got on my shelf a book of Winston Churchill quotations, but it doesn't mean that the person that wrote that book didn't think that Churchill, was prime minister during the Second World War and all the rest of it. But in Thomas, I think it's more than that. It's not just he's chosen to look at sayings rather than deeds. I think it's actually the choice of sayings is fundamental to his theology. It's fundamental to the way that he sees Jesus's significance. In other words, he thinks that if you really want to find salvation, you need to look at the sayings.
So let me read for you the not that you need to hear it, but the very opening, because it sounds like you think this is really, from what you just said, as somebody who knows these things, it sounds to me like you're saying this is really kind of the key, where Jesus says, where the author says, these are the hidden sayings that the living Jesus spoke, and Didymus Judas Thomas wrote them down. And he said, whoever finds the interpretation of these sayings will not taste death.
Mm-hmm. Fundamental. That's just. I mean, isn't it? So one of the things is that always makes me smile about Gospel of Thomas scholarship is people talk about the Gospel of Thomas like it's this great enigma. And to some extent, it is, in the sense of why does he do this and why does he do that? There is no question at all about why he's actually writing the book. Because it's right there in the incipit, which you quote. He says, look, if you want to find salvation, if you really want to if you don't want to taste death, this is what you need to do. And it's not believe in Jesus' salvific death. It's not Son of Man, ransom for many, anything like that. If you really want not to taste death, you need to find the interpretation of these sayings that I'm about to, give to you. So, I think that's and the taste death thing is fascinating, because in Mark 9:1 we have, some of you standing here will not taste death before they see the kingdom of God come with power. And Thomas is shifting things right away from that kind of big apocalyptic idea to it's something that happens now. It's something that happens in the way that you actually process what Jesus has said.
So not when he says, if you understand the interpretation thing, you won't taste it, it means you'll have eternal life.
Right.
And it's by interpreting these particular sayings that you're going to have, that puts a lot of pressure on an interpreter.
Totally. And actually, and I think therein lies one of the fascinations with the Gospel of Thomas, which is that if you read it without any help, you keep thinking, I wonder if somebody can actually help me read this. Is there a key? Is there a code? Is there someone I can talk to? And although we can't know this, I actually wonder if the document, in a sense, is trying to make you think that, so that you do go to somebody who can say, let me explain this to you. This is what this means. This is what this means. This is what this means. I can't guarantee that's the case, but I think I think it's setting itself up so that there needs to be something more than just this text. The text needs an interpreter, a reader, an expounder.
You need somebody because you're right. We'll talk about some of the specific sayings, but I mean, there are things here that, like, at least to modern readers, they don't make any sense. And so you think, man, somebody didn't tell me what this means, I'm sunk.
Exactly.
And then I don't have eternal life.
No, and I think it wants you to think that. I mean, I mean, people talk about Gospel of Thomas being enigmatic, but I think it's enigmatic because the author wants it to be, and to some extent that is in continuity with other gospels, because Mark's gospel has got elements of that. It's got this idea that there's a secret. Yeah. There's a secret which certain people have got access to, and lots of people don't have access to and remain outside. So this is not some amazing new idea that there's a kind of something hidden that you've got to discover. That's already there in the tradition before Thomas.
But I mean, I would think, Mark, it seems like it's a little bit different, because in Mark, at least the reader knows what the secret is.
Right. Yeah.
And here you're saying, like, this is like taking it a step farther again, that it's so is it presupposing a community then? Is it presupposing, what?
I think it must be, or at the very least, it's presupposing somebody who can explain to you what's going on, because it consciously stops short of explaining stuff. So, I mean, one of the obvious examples is all three synoptic gospels have got the parable of the sower and its interpretation. And whatever you think about the interpretation of the parable of the sower, at least those gospel writers thought that they were interpreting what Jesus was saying. Gospel of Thomas has the parable of the sower, no interpretation. And that to me implies that there is somebody in the community, the guru, your leader, who is saying, let me explain to you what's going on here. So I think it does set itself up to point beyond itself to that person that's going to do the interpreting for you.
But so if whether it's just this author who wants you to come to him to get eternal life, or or with its communal knowledge, either way, it sounds like these are followers of Jesus who don't think the death and resurrection of Jesus is all that important for salvation.
That's the only thing I can conclude. I mean, I sometimes used to wonder back in the day whether it's just a case of the genre. Maybe the guy accepts fundamentally everything that he's seen in other aspects of proto-Orthodox Christianity, or whatever you want to call it, and just says, but I've got these extra sayings. But I don't think it is that, because the author seems to think that the sayings themselves are connected to salvation. It's not just that he's kind of really interested in adding this. It's not. I don't get the sense it's supplementing other stuff. I think it's got its own idea of a kind of world that you get invited into. It's almost like a gateway text. It's almost like it's saying, come and experience this different Jesus, and experience him through what he said.
Interesting. So when he says that, what was the exact words? That whoever finds the interpretation,
right?
Does it just mean like if you like understand, or does it mean like you act on them somehow?
I don't know. I mean, I assume that there has to be something more than just some kind of intellectual assent to what they think that Jesus is saying. There must be some kind of internalizing and acting out of stuff. But I mean, one of the things I think provides a good clue is Gospel of Thomas 13 has an amazing discussion between Jesus and, so Jesus asks three people who he is. And he asks Peter, and he asks Matthew, and then he asks Thomas. And given that we already know that this is the secret sayings that Thomas wrote down, we already know, especially if there's the rule of three as well, but we already know that the one that's asked third, Thomas, is going to be the one that's got the right answer. But the hilarious thing is, you don't actually get to hear what Thomas properly thinks. Thomas basically says that, words can't describe what you are. And Jesus then speaks three words into Thomas's ear and doesn't tell you what they are. And it's just this, it's this sort of sublimely irritating thing, because what the author's doing is dangling in front of you the idea that we've got the secret, but then it's not actually telling you, which is why I do think it keeps pointing beyond itself.
Yes, right. Because somebody, right, okay, yeah, good. So the thing is that even if it's not just like all in your head, it is based on kind of knowing the right stuff. Right? You've got two questions about that. They're kind of big, but I mean, you've got this gospel that's about interpreting sayings and bringing eternal life. And would you call this a Christian gospel? I mean, it doesn't have the death and resurrection of Jesus in it.
Yeah, it's a really tough one, because obviously it's a Jesus-y gospel. I mean, the word Jesus comes tons of times. I do wonder whether the author of this gospel would have owned the word Christian insofar as he never uses the word Christ in the gospel. And that's kind of striking. I mean, let's compare this with Paul. I mean, I don't know the exact figure, but I know that Paul says the word Christ, Christos, like over 300 times, depending on how you count. And in all four canonical gospels, the word Christ is absolutely key. But the Gospel of Thomas doesn't seem to want to own that term for Jesus. So that's kind of, insofar as Jesus has any title in Thomas, it's the living one.
Yes, that's right.
And that's fascinating, because that is something you do get in other later gospels, the idea of Jesus as the living one.
Yes.
And I do sometimes wonder, and this is, people disagree about this, but I do sometimes wonder whether the Gospel of Thomas is trying to say that we shouldn't be thinking in terms of death and resurrection in terms of something that Jesus sort of moves through and that the believer kind of moves through. It's more about living now. So the choice, he could have called Jesus the resurrected one, yes, or the crucified one, or the crucified Christ, but he chooses to say the living one. That might be significant, that, he doesn't pitch it as being a resurrected Jesus. Just the Jesus that you hear is the one who lives. So it's a tough one. I don't know the answer. I mean, do you have a sense for that? I don't really have a sense of whether it's Christian or not.
Well, depending, obviously, I guess the key is whether you call it, whether the term Christian is appropriate for any of these authors.
Right, exactly.
There's a big move among scholars that I'm not completely comfortable with, but there's a move among scholars to say that you shouldn't use the term Christian yet because they don't have doctrines. But to me, it always seems a little bit weird, because at what point do you have?
Right. Yeah.
Well, they don't believe the right things. Yeah, okay. So, but it does seem to me that you've got people who think that Jesus provides eternal life. And you mentioned Paul and the Gospels, and they're obsessed with the death and resurrection of Jesus.
Totally.
Paul, I knew nothing among you but Christ and him crucified.
Right.
And Paul doesn't, he barely ever mentions any of the sayings of Jesus. And for Thomas, it's all the sayings of Jesus without any death and resurrection. For Paul, it's death. And for as you know, I mean, a lot of people talk about the Gospels as passion narratives with long introductions.
That's right.
It's all about so I guess you could say that, people believe Jesus brought eternal life in radically different ways. And if you want to call them Christians, then I guess you'd say they're just different groups, right? Different.
Well, it's a fun question to ask, because, what's the audience for something like this? Do they already know, for want of a better term, other Christian texts? My sense is that what you're dealing with here is an author, a community, a group of people who assume that that basic Christian story and who are offering you something fresh, something in addition to that sort of replaces it for them. They can't deny it. They're not saying Jesus was not, crucified and resurrected. There's no sense of trying to counter it. It's more that they just want to get the camera and just turn it in another direction and move it away. So I assume that the people that it's appealing to is people who are going to go, oh, I didn't know this other whole side about Jesus. I think that's where it's going. I
mean, we do know of other groups that don't think the death of Jesus, explicitly don't think the death of Jesus brings salvation. And this is going to be my second issue, whether it's Christian or not, it's one thing, but would you call this a Gnostic gospel? I mean, it's emphasizing, the importance of having correct knowledge for salvation.
Mm-hmm.
So, in fact, maybe we should back up for a second, because we don't want to get too far in the weeds without everybody knowing where we are just now. Yeah. So could you just, this thing was originally classified among the Gnostic, called a Gnostic gospel. And the discovery at Nag Hammadi that you mentioned earlier was people call that collection of 12 codices, the Gnostic Gospels, or so. And this is one of them. And so could you just tell us what this means? What Gnosticism?
Sure.
Do this in 10 seconds.
It's a difficult one. Okay. Well, the thing is, there's one warning and then there's one invitation. I think the warning is, if we go too quickly to saying that Thomas is a Gnostic gospel alongside lots of other Gnostic gospels, I think that there's a real danger that we use that as a way of marginalizing it and making it unimportant in the history of Christianity. And it means that what you do is you're basically putting it in a box with a bunch of other texts, a lot of which are very different from the Gospel of Thomas. So I think the term Gnostic and Gnosticism has quite often been used as a way of shunting it over there so we don't need to look at it.
Can I
go for it?
Before you get on to your next thing, the warning. I know a lot of people say that there's obviously throughout the history of the discipline that's been right. It's like, oh, it's a heresy, kind of thing. But I got to say, calling something Gnostic doesn't denigrate it to me at all.
Right.
I mean, for me, it's just like, wow, that's interesting. It's more like a neutral term, but so.
Right. Well, so that does anticipate a little bit what I was going to say for the invitation, which is that Thomas is actually not ashamed of talking about gnosis knowledge. And in fact, for Thomas, gnosis knowledge is much more important than faith. There are several places where Thomas brings in knowledge as a very positive term. And it's worth remembering, too, as you've written about, when Irenaeus writes his big piece against the Gnostics, he says knowledge falsely so called. There's no question that they claimed they had knowledge, or so, for want of a better term, they claimed they were Gnostic. The question is, were they right or not? That's what they argued about. So to that extent, I think Thomas is Gnostic in that it thinks knowledge and knowledge of Jesus is the thing that brings salvation, as opposed to, say, faith. It doesn't like the term faith; it likes the term knowledge better. But my worry just on the categorizing side, it's simply that I don't like the way that Thomas gets thrown in with a bunch of other texts that might not necessarily be from the same kind of school. And that's the bit where I think there's been, as you know, there's been so much good scholarship, which is basically saying, don't use the term Gnostic to sort of, but box a whole bunch of really disparate stuff together. Yeah. That's the worry about it,
It's obviously a hugely important concern and completely legitimate. But I will say that people who say that and emphasize it also use other words like Christian.
Yeah.
I mean, if you call it a Christian text, what does it mean? Even the modern world. I mean, is an Appalachian snake handler and a Greek Orthodox priest, are they like on the same page here? And so, but we still call them Christian. And so it seems like if you would define the term anyway. So could you just tell people what, do you have like a 30-second description of Gnosticism so they know what we're talking about here?
Oh, gosh. Well, the best thing to say is that if you want to read a really fantastic Gnostic text, then Apocryphal of John is the way to go. And
you won't understand it though.
I know, but it's just wonderful. The idea of the idea that I'm just going to retell you the story of the Garden of Eden. I'm going to retell you how the world, kind of got there. And then you can go to Hypostasis of the Archons. It does the same thing. It basically retells what people thought they knew about the universe. And probably, I mean, it's difficult to do in 10 seconds, but I suppose one of the fundamental things is there's a whole bunch of powers and authorities out there who are influencing people's lives in all sorts of ways that they probably didn't realize that they were. And a lot of Gnostic texts are really interested in digging down to who they are, where they come from, why they're important, and what we can do about it. But that's where I sort of join with those that worry about calling Gospel of Thomas Gnostic in those senses, in that you really haven't got a lot in the Gospel of Thomas that is interested in these powers and authorities, these archons, these whether you want to call them intermediaries or whatever you want to call. Thomas just doesn't seem to be interested in speculating about cosmic origins and all that kind of stuff. So even though it sits right alongside the Apocryphal of John in the Nag Hammadi codices, it's a really different text. It's really different.
But I guess you could say that, I mean, earlier you were thinking that maybe Thomas is a bunch of saints for people who already know about the death and resurrection of Jesus, and it's adding on. You could say the same thing about these Gnostic speculations about these principalities, and that it's tacking onto that. And so it's a tricky business.
I mean, Hypostasis of the Archons actually begins with quotations from Paul's epistle to the Ephesians. I mean, and basically says, okay, Paul says there's principalities and powers, and then the Hypostasis of the Archons says, okay, what are they? Where do they come from? And boom, and then we go in. So the idea that these people were not reading text that we call New Testament is clearly not the case, I think.
Yeah. Is there a way to kind of summarize what Thomas is about? I mean, you've got these 114 sayings. We know you've got to interpret them. Are there some themes that you think stand out in the gospel?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think the number one theme is this whole idea of singularity or unity. The Gospel of Thomas is really worried about the idea of division and the idea of a person somehow not being kind of unified with themselves. So if there's one thing that keeps coming through, it's this idea of singularity, of becoming one, even in probably the most weird and controversial of Thomas's sayings, which is 114 right at the end, where you have Simon Peter questions whether Mary Magdalene should be part of the Jesus crowd or not. And Jesus quite remarkably replies, well, we can make Mary male. If we make Mary male, then she will be able to be part of this group. And although we see that and we find it absolutely shocking, there does seem to be a really key element in Thomas's theology about how the male and female need to be the same thing. They need to be a unified being, if you like. And that is also something you do get in other Gnostic texts, is this idea of the kind of going back to some kind of pre-Adam state where you have male and female God created as one. And so that, I think, is the ultimate, is becoming single, becoming not conflicted, not a divided persona.
Is it a psychological thing? Is like we're just scatterbrained and we need to be more kind of consistent? Or is it that what's it mean? What's it mean to become unified?
I really wish I knew. I really wish that
you're not going to have eternal life if you don't figure it out.
Right, I know. Well, maybe we're just doomed, Bart. I mean, but I mean, that's one of the things that really, really baffles me about it. I mean, we have one reference as well in the Gospel of Thomas to the bridal chamber, which is a key theme in other texts like the Gospel of Philip. And it does look like there is some idea that somehow if you want to attain unity with Jesus or unity with the divine ideal, you actually have to undo a lot of what makes you this kind of fleshly person. And one of those things is gender.
Yes.
Far from celebrating gender differences, it's all about eliding them and becoming like the perfect androgynous human being. But yes. I don't know what it meant in practice. I don't know what went on in the communities, and whether it was just like a kind of coffee shop discussion group philosophizing thing, or whether they actually had any ritual that was, connected with it.
Because I mean, there are some scholars who read the text as saying that the way to be unified is in fact to escape your material existence in some sense, and which is that the conflict is between your material physical self and your spiritual self, and that you need to escape that. And some people think that of that in a kind of a Gnostic way, right? The spark of the divine within you will escape and return to its heavenly home. Other people think that it's actually just talking about asceticism, that you need to lead a more kind of strict, disciplined life and not cave into bodily pleasures. Do you have an opinion about that?
Well, and also, but also both in the sense that it might be that asceticism leads you to that kind of way of somehow like undoing the material existence, so that if you fast, you become much less focused on this body. If you stop thinking about sex all the time, then maybe that stops you being so focused on this body. So I think both can be true. And there's actually a very good book on this by a guy called Richard Valentarsis that argues that Gospel of Thomas is a really ascetic text. I found that quite persuasive, that it makes sense if you're saying to people, don't be in, food, sex, gender, all of these things that make you who you are as part of this fleshly existence, that they're the things that are kind of shunted away and denigrated.
Yeah.
Thomas.
Yeah. Well, no, I agree. And it is a very interesting book that he was trying to write it to kind of argue against the Gnostic thesis, right?
That's right.
You don't need Gnosticism. But I kind of like the way you were putting it, that it's not necessarily an either or. It actually could be because there, anyway. So yeah. Right. Okay, good. Are there sayings in here that you have trouble figuring out the way I do?
Oh my goodness! I sometimes think most of them. I mean, we mentioned earlier on. Blessed is the.
Let me read it. Number 7.
Yeah, go for it. Go for it. Yeah.
Okay, so I have my students, but I'll tell you what I do with my students is I have them go through Thomas and pick 3 sayings, one of which, and interpret each one in a Gnostic way and one in a non-Gnostic way, and then see which they like better. And so like for this one, it's a scream, because Jesus said, "Blessed is the lion that the human will eat, so that the lion becomes human. And
Brilliant.
Cursed is the human whom the lion will eat, and the lion will become human."
Fantastic.
It's great.
Yeah, it is great. And I think actually, and earlier, I think I said it was P-Oxy 1. It's actually not. It's P-Oxy 654. But not that we need to. But anyway.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Okay,
But it is.
One had a little bit of that. Okay, maybe not.
That's just I think it's 654. I was just thinking about that while we were chatting. But no, I've actually. So they're in. I mean, as you know, there's entire articles written about this. Not very convincing. No. I just look at it. I actually wonder. I sometimes think that the author is actually deliberately trying to provoke the reader. It's being deliberately enigmatic in the sense that it really wants to kind of shock you, and it works, because I still remember the first time I read the Gospel of Thomas through, and I just had my mouth open the whole time.
Right.
And I think we're on slightly different sides of the question of whether or not Thomas is familiar with the Synoptic Gospels specifically, but whether or not he's familiar with the Synoptic Gospels as text. What is fascinating is that a lot of the, for want of a better, let's call them funky sayings. I called them once strange sayings, and Nicola Denzi Lewis told me off for saying strange. I said the word I wanted to use was funky, but it's not a very academic term. So since we're in a podcast, let's say funky.
Funky, yeah, that's better because
I like it because we like funky. At least I like funky. And one of the things is that you never go too far in the Gospel of Thomas without getting something that's paralleled in the Synoptics. So you go 2 or 3 sayings, you'll get something funky, and then you'll get something that if you're a reader of the Synoptics, you'll recognize. And I actually think that's conscious on the author's part. I think that he's saying, okay, this might sound like Jesus's voice has changed a bit, but then you get reassured. No, it's still the Jesus we know. It still really is Jesus. You know, he's not done 100%. He's not written a complete book of totally new sayings. You generally go synoptic parallel, new saying, new saying, synoptic, new saying, synoptic. You go 2 or 3 all the way through. You never get a chunk that I can find of more than like 3 new sayings back to back. And so I think that there is a legitimating function there. I think, yes, he wants Jesus to sound different, but I don't think he wants him to sound so different that people are going to go, well, this isn't Jesus.
So I've got 2 big questions left. And one is this thing about the synoptics. So Matthew, Mark, and Luke, they have a lot of sayings of Jesus. And Thomas, I don't know what your count is. I mean, roughly about half sound kind of like Matthew.
It's about half.
Yeah. So just say what your book is about. Then I want to ask about Jesus.
Sure, okay.
But I want to know, so you think that the author of the Gospel of Thomas had access to Matthew, Mark, and Luke, and used them.
Yeah, I argue that Thomas knows all 3 synoptics. He's got parallels with every strand of synoptic material. So he has material that's just in Matthew, the material that's just in Mark, material that's just in Luke. He has stuff that's in both Matthew and Luke, and he has stuff that's in all 3 of them. And I think what he's trying to do, I think he's providing synoptic-like sayings and synoptic sayings to legitimize the other stuff. If you come up with a new text, there's always the problem that people are going to go, well, why should I believe this? How do we know you haven't just composed this yourself? And it's like, well, listen, this is the Jesus that we know. Listen, we've got the parable of the sower here. We've got the parable of the seed growing secretly. So it's a little like, I think it's a similar thing that's going on in John's gospel, but John does it in a very different way. John obviously has like mainly new material that's not in the synoptics, but he puts it into a synoptic frame, i.e. a Galilean ministry with a passion and resurrection story, a passion narrative with an extended introduction. So he does the same thing. He legitimizes this radical new material. So when people are hearing it, well, it sounds like a gospel, even though, so I think Thomas is doing something like that, but in a way that is potentially a bit more risky because he's not because the whole thing, the whole frame of the Gospel of Thomas is so different. But I think that's what's going on. I think it's it's an attempt to legitimize, because otherwise, you turn up, someone just arrives at your church one day and says, hey, I've got this new gospel. The first thought is, have you? Where'd you get that from then?
If you're enjoying the Misquoting Jesus podcast, you'd probably like my online courses as well. I've produced a number so far with multi-lecture courses on the New Testament Gospels and the books of the Pentateuch, standalone lectures on the Christmas story and the earliest Christian views of Jesus, and a 6-hour debate on whether Jesus was actually raised from the dead. If you're interested, check them out at barterman.com. You'll receive a discount on your purchase simply by entering the code MJPodcast. Yeah. Right. Okay. Well, so just could you just say something in general terms? If you've got 2, suppose you find 2 documents from the ancient world or 4 documents from the ancient world, and you don't know anything, but you're trying to show that one of them used the other or used the other. What kinds of things do you do? What for you? What seems probative? What seems like it actually demonstrates that one person used another?
Right. I mean, that's a great question because obviously we've got what we've got, which is a tiny proportion of what was actually out there in antiquity. So, there's, in a sense, if Thomas knew the synoptics, you might say, well, that's kind of a big coincidence, because what about the 100 other things that we've lost? What about if it knew all of those as well? Mm-hmm. And I think my feeling is you simply have to look to see whether the redactional authorial fingerprints of one particular author show up in another author.
Whoa, so, you need to unpack that, because that made a lot of sense to me.
I'm sorry. I'm sorry. Yeah.
Better explain what you mean.
I know. I'm sorry. That was real. That was proper scholarly geek.
Boy, it was
there,
good too.
It?
Yeah. No, it's important. Yeah. Go ahead though. What do you mean?
So I think that, we both think that Luke and Matthew knew Mark. And one of the reasons that we think Luke and Matthew knew Mark is that you can see little things that are characteristic of Mark, that are distinctive of Mark's authorial style, popping up in Matthew and Luke. So, for example, Mark has got this emphasis on the messianic secret. Matthew and Luke tend to play it down, but it still makes its presence felt. And you go, oh, okay, they've just pulled this in, from Mark. It's a Markan characteristic that they've taken over. Mm-hmm. So by analogy, when I'm looking at the Gospel of Thomas, I'm saying, am I seeing things that are really characteristic of the way that Matthew writes, that are finding their way into Thomas, or really characteristic of the way that Luke writes, that are finding their way into Thomas? So that's what I mean by redactional fingerprint, that sometimes Luke will write in a particular way and Thomas will take over that particular way of talking.
Is this on a verbal level, like on a word level, or an idea level, or
both? It has to be on. I mean, words alone aren't enough, but it has to be some kind of conceptual level as well. I mean, probably the easiest way to illustrate is by giving an example. So, Gospel of Thomas 79 has a woman stands up in the crowd and she goes, "Blessed is the womb that bore you and the breast that gave you suck." And Jesus says, "Blessed rather is the person that hears the word of God and does it." And that has a parallel in Luke chapter 11. And the fun thing about that is, you can't find a more Lucan saying anywhere. Luke is the only one of the evangelists that consistently uses anatomical details, especially about women's bodies. He's also the person amongst the evangelists that will have that kind of foil question and answer, and the theology of hearing the word of God and doing it. So I argue that when you see parallels between Luke and Thomas like that, it looks like Luke's composed it and Thomas has taken it over. So in a nutshell, that's kind of what I'm getting at when I say authorial fingerprint.
Yeah. Okay. So in your judgment, about half of the sayings then are some ways being edited from the synoptics, and partly to legitimate this account, right, but also because obviously he's picking the ones that he agrees with, right? I mean, he's not just doing it to these are the ones that he subscribes to. The others, where are the others coming from?
So such a good question. I assume that he has some knowledge of Jesus' tradition and that he's pulling stuff in from there. It's not entirely possible. I've often wondered, I mean, has he just made this stuff up? Does he just think that somehow he's caught up in the spirit and he's got some kind of connection with the divine and is making it up? I don't think so, because they are so odd and disjointed. I would expect someone who thought that he was in some kind of spiritual, kind of reception of stuff, it wouldn't be so disjointed. I think he's got a bunch of sayings that he wants to get in there. He's got a bunch of takes on the synoptic sayings, and I do think it is a bit of a collection, a mishmash. And I think mishmash sounds derogatory. I mean, but it is a collection. It's like a scrapbook. And I think Gospel of Philip is analogous to it in the sense that you get these frequent changes where you'll get a saying and then something goes in. And this is not someone that's composing it from whole cloth. This is someone who's pulled something from here, something from there, something from there.
I personally think you're right. I do get a lot of emails from people who are spiritual, who give me a head, just a bunch of mishmash to use, which is like, wow, this ain't making sense to me. And it seems like they're a smart person, but wow, okay. So, all right. So, but I tend to think there's so much material out there, orally and written, that people, unless you've got a really good reason for thinking they're just making stuff up, I think you need the good reason for thinking that. Could you just say something about the value of this, the Gospel of Thomas, for understanding what Jesus really said and did? It doesn't help for anything he did because it doesn't narrate anything. For Jesus saying, is there? Because some people pointed out that some of these saying, scholars have argued, this saying is more like Jesus said it than in Mark's version, and they kind of argue about that. But are there things here that can help us know about the historical Jesus that we can't get from somewhere else?
I desperately wish there was. I mean, I think. I mean, maybe people are smiling at this. I don't know, but I think I'm more skeptical than you are about access to historical Jesus sayings in things like the Gospel of Thomas. And I think I probably overall tend to think that the evangelists are a bit more creative than other people do. So I actually don't rule out at all that the canonical evangelists too, compose stuff from their imaginations and from what they'd inferred from elsewhere. I don't think there's a single saying in the Gospel of Thomas where I look at it and go, gosh, I wonder if Jesus said that.
Yeah.
I mean, so I must admit, I do feel a bit skeptical about it. And part of that is that all the sayings that seem most plausible as things that the historical Jesus said are things that have got parallels in the synoptic gospels. So my friend April DeConnick, for example, she wrote an excellent book on the Gospel of Thomas where she tried to get a kernel of the Gospel of Thomas and she get to a kernel of what is most likely to be the earliest layer and therefore have the best witness to being historical Jesus material. But nearly every single one in her kernel has got a synoptic parallel.
Yeah.
Nearly every single one, and the stuff that hasn't is the stuff that's unique to Thomas. So that's where my problem lies on the historical Jesus front. I wish it were otherwise. And I do stress that. I mean, I would love it if it turned out that Thomas does have some sort of pipeline to the historical Jesus in the same way that, hope springs eternal with discovery of other ancient Christian gospels. I desperate for someone to discover the Egerton gospel and us have something that, could be genuinely old and authentic, or at least as authentic as other texts we've got.
Yeah. Well, actually, I don't think we're too far apart on this one. In one extent, I don't think any of the non-synoptic sayings has much of a chance of being historical.
Okay.
I think the difference is, just for people to understand the difference between us, is that I've tended to think that Thomas did not rely on Matthew, Mark, and Luke, and that would make it an independent witness to these sayings, and so it would mean that there would be different lines of transmission down. And so that supports it supports the idea that something like this is closer to what Jesus said, because but if Thomas is just taking over the synoptics, then it's not of much use. It's basically of no use for knowing what the historical Jesus said. And for me, it's just the synoptic sayings, which I think might have an independent line of trajectory down to.
Sure.
But it's not a hill I'm willing to die on. And in Thomas, there's no hills to die on. He doesn't have the crucifixion. Mark, you have any final words for us about Thomas? And what's the name of your book? Tell us your book.
It's called Thomas and the Gospels. And it has a different subtitle depending whether you look at the British or the American one. The title I gave it was a very boring one. The subtitle was "The Case for Thomas's Familiarity with the Synoptics," but my British editor called it "The Making of an Apocryphal Text," which is way better.
Oh, that's good. Yeah,
it's much better. Yeah, so I actually tend to call it that when I quote it, because I like their words better than my own.
Well, that's the thing about titles, is that authors always want them to be kind of precise description.
Yeah,
and usually those. And publishers they'll listen to you, but they basically say, "Yeah, forget it. We're not calling it that."
yeah. We're going to call it misquoting Jesus.
Well, exactly. Oh boy, yeah, exactly. Didn't like that one, but it worked. Yeah. So, well, do you have any final words of wisdom for us for this text that values wisdom?
Well, I think the one thing I would say is that it's really, really worth people reading. I mean, that's and going back to what we were saying earlier on, one thing that I don't like is when people try to use my work as an excuse for not engaging texts like the Gospel of Thomas. That really drives me nuts, because honestly, if you want a really enriched idea of the varieties of early Christianity. I know there's a term Christianity, but if you want a kind of an idea of the varieties, then you have to get to terms with these texts. And it's so much fun. It's so intellectually exciting. So I think the main thing is I'll say to people, just read it and enjoy it and be mystified by it, because that's what it wants you to do.
And it's not hard to read. It might be hard to understand, but I mean, it's 114 sayings of Jesus. We're not talking about, 3 weeks of labor reading this thing.
Yeah,
it's quite. You'll be, I completely agree. Well, Mark, this has been great. It's been a lot of fun, and really appreciate your insights into all of this. I'm sure everybody's listening to this. So I hope we've got a lot of things we can talk about. And so maybe some other time we'll get together and thrash out something else.
Yeah, delighted to do it. It's such fun chatting about these things.
Yeah, thanks. Well, and thank you all for listening in on this. And we appreciate you tuning into the podcast. Next week, we're back with something else, and God knows what it is, because I don't. All right. Thanks, Mark.
Cheers, Bart. Pleasure.
Yeah.
This has been an episode of Misquoting Jesus with Bart Ehrman. We'll be back with a new episode next Tuesday, so please be sure to subscribe to our show for free on your favorite podcast listening app or on Bart Ehrman's YouTube channel so you don't miss out. From Bart Ehrman and myself, Megan Lewis, thank you for joining us.